Today we're heading to China, where the Gobi Desert grows by about 3,000 kilometers each year. Known locally as the Yellow Dragon, its expansion has led to many people becoming climate refugees.
Back in the 1970s, China announced something that seemed completely insane. They were going to plant billions of trees across a massive stretch of desert and dry land that covered nearly half the country.
When you think of desert, what comes to your mind? Endless sand, scorching heat, no signs of life? Well, welcome to Xinjiang, where deserts are not dying.
The goal? Stop the advancing deserts from swallowing cities, farmland, and entire communities. Experts from around the world shook their heads. Many laughed. Some called it a waste of resources. But China went ahead anyway, and what happened over the next few decades would shock everyone who doubted them. When the desert started swallowing everything. To understand why China did something so extreme, you need to picture what was happening. By the mid-20th century, northern China was in serious trouble. The Gobi Desert and other arid regions weren't just sitting there peacefully. They were expanding, moving south and east, consuming everything in their path. Farmland turned to dust, rivers dried up, entire villages had to relocate because sand dunes literally buried their homes. Dust storms became a regular nightmare. These weren't just windy days with some sand in the air. We're talking about massive walls of dust that could travel thousands of kilometers, blocking out the sun and making it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. Beijing, one of the world's major cities, got hammered by these storms regularly. Spring would arrive, and with it came yellow skies and air so thick with particles that people couldn't breathe properly. Schools closed. Hospitals filled up with respiratory cases. The economic damage was staggering. Farmers watched their topsoil blow away, sometimes losing entire harvests in a single storm. The desert was advancing at a rate of about 1,300 square miles per year in some areas. That's roughly the size of Rhode Island, disappearing under sand annually. Water sources dried up as vegetation vanished. Without plants to hold the soil and maintain the water cycle, the land became increasingly barren. But it wasn't just an environmental issue. This was threatening China's ability to feed its population. The country was already dealing with massive challenges related to food security, and now prime agricultural land was turning into wasteland. Something had to be done, and traditional methods weren't cutting it. The situation was getting worse, not better, and scientists warned that if nothing changed, the deserts would continue their march toward major population centers. The 3 North Shelter Belt project begins. In 1978, the Chinese government launched what would become one of the most ambitious environmental projects in human history. They called it the 3 North Shelter Belt program, sometimes known as the Great Green Wall. The plan was almost incomprehensible in scale. They would create a barrier of forests stretching 4,500 kilometers across northern China, from Xinjiang in the west to Heilongjiang in the east. The project was designed to last 73 years, ending in 2050, and would cover about 42% of China's land area. The core strategy was straightforward, but massive. Plant billions of trees and other vegetation to create a living barrier against desertification. The green belt would serve multiple purposes. It would stabilize soil with root systems, reduce wind speeds that carried sand and dust, restore moisture to the air through transpiration, and gradually rebuild ecosystems that had been destroyed. The government mobilized resources on a scale that only a centralized system could manage. They allocated enormous budgets, deployed military units, organized student groups, and coordinated with local communities. The project wasn't just about throwing seeds at the ground and hoping for the best. Scientists had to figure out which species could actually survive in these harsh conditions. Most trees need decent soil, regular water, and moderate temperatures. The northern Chinese deserts offered none of these things. Engineers and botanists worked together to develop techniques that might work. They studied native species that had managed to survive in marginal areas. They experimented with different planting methods. They built nurseries to cultivate seedlings that could be transplanted. The logistics alone were mind-boggling. How do you deliver millions of seedlings to remote desert areas with limited infrastructure? How do you ensure they get enough water during those critical first months? The project divided the work into phases and regions. Different provinces had different targets and timelines. Local governments received quotas for how many trees needed to be planted and maintained. It became a national priority, with regular progress reports and adjustments based on what was working and what wasn't. This wasn't a short-term publicity stunt. China was committing to a multi-generational effort that would require sustained investment and attention for decades. Why everyone called it impossible? International observers were skeptical, and they had good reasons. First, the sheer scale seemed unrealistic. China was proposing to plant forests across an area roughly the size of Germany, in deserts where it barely rains. The historical track record for this kind of project wasn't encouraging. Many countries had tried smaller reforestation efforts in difficult terrain, and most had failed or produced disappointing results. Ecologists pointed out fundamental problems with the approach. Deserts exist for reasons related to climate, geography, and atmospheric patterns. You can't just plant trees and expect those massive natural forces to reverse. The northern Chinese regions were dry because of their continental location, mountain rain shadows, and global circulation patterns. Trees need water, and if there isn't enough precipitation, they'll simply die. Even if you irrigate them initially, that's not sustainable over thousands of square kilometers for decades. There were also concerns about the choice of species. Early plans relied heavily on fast-growing trees like poplars and certain pine species. Critics worried these monoculture forests would be vulnerable to disease and pests. In nature, diverse ecosystems are resilient because if one species fails, others survive. But if you plant millions of the same tree and a pest or disease adapts to it, you could lose everything. Some called it ecological naivety on a grand scale. The economic arguments against the project were just as strong. China in 1978 was just beginning its period of economic reform. The country wasn't wealthy. Investing enormous sums in a project that might not work and wouldn't show results for decades seemed like terrible resource allocation. That money could go toward industrial development, education, healthcare, or infrastructure that would provide immediate returns. Planting trees in deserts looked like throwing money into sand. Then there was the human factor. The project required millions of people to plant and maintain these forests, often in remote and harsh conditions. Workers would need to be paid, fed, and housed. The dropout rate would be high. Maintaining motivation over decades for a project with no short-term payoff seemed impossible. Many experts simply didn't believe China could sustain the organizational will and resource commitment the project demanded. Burying plants, building barriers, and fighting sand. The actual work of combating desertification required innovation and sheer determination. The term burying plants comes from one of the key techniques used. In sandy desert areas, simply planting a tree normally doesn't work because the shifting sand exposes or buries the roots. So workers developed a method where they'd partially bury shrubs and grasses, especially species like salix, which can sprout new roots from buried stems. The buried portions would stabilize and send out root systems, while new growth emerged above the sand. They also used checkerboard sand barriers, which became one of the project's signature techniques. Workers would create a grid pattern using straw, reeds, or branches, pushing them into the sand to form squares about 1 meter on each side. These barriers reduce wind speed at ground level, which prevents sand from moving. Inside each square, they'd plant drought-resistant vegetation. As the plants grew, their roots would eventually take over the stabilization work. You can find photographs showing vast stretches of desert covered in these geometric patterns, a bizarre sight that looks almost like abstract art. Water was always the critical limitation. In some areas, they built basic irrigation systems using groundwater or redirected water from distant sources, but that wasn't feasible everywhere, so the focus shifted to species selection. Scientists identified and cultivated plants with extreme drought tolerance. These included various native shrubs, grasses, and trees that had evolved to survive with minimal water. Some species, like Saxol and Caragana, could tap deep groundwater with extensive root systems. The project also involved aerial seeding in some regions. Aircraft would fly over accessible areas and drop seed balls, small packages of seeds mixed with clay and nutrients. This method allowed them to cover vast areas quickly, though success rates were lower than hand planting. It was a numbers game in some ways. If even 20% of aerial seeds produced surviving plants, that was still millions of new trees and shrubs established with relatively little labor. Local communities played a crucial role, though not always willingly at first. The government implemented policies that assigned tree planting responsibilities to households and collectives. People were given plots to plant and maintain, with their performance sometimes tied to other benefits. Over time, as results became visible and as people saw economic opportunities in sustainable forestry and agriculture, participation became more genuine. Farmers who successfully established tree cover on marginal land could use it for fruit trees, nuts, or sustainable timber. The work was brutal. Desert conditions meant extreme temperatures, scarce water, and constant wind. Sandstorms would sometimes undo weeks of work in a few hours. Survival rates for planted seedlings were often low, especially in the early years. Workers would plant an area, only to return and find half the trees dead. They'd replant, and replant again. The project became a war of attrition against one of Earth's harshest environments. The turning point, when green started winning. Real progress wasn't obvious for years. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, the project continued largely on faith and political will. Then, gradually, monitoring data started showing changes. Satellite imagery from the late 1990s revealed something remarkable. In certain regions, particularly in areas that had received intense planting efforts for 15 to 20 years, vegetation cover was measurably increasing. The desert wasn't just being held back in a few places, it was actually retreating. One of the early success stories came from the Kabuki Desert in Inner Mongolia, the seventh largest desert in China. This wasn't technically part of the 3 North project initially, but used similar techniques. Over about 30 years, roughly a third of the Kabuki Desert was transformed from barren sand to vegetation-covered land. Local communities had been organized to plant drought-resistant plants, build sand barriers, and develop sustainable economic activities around the restored land. The results were visible from space. Scientists studying the project began publishing research that confirmed the transformation. Forest coverage in the 3 North region increased from about 5% in 1978 to over 13% by the 2010s. That might not sound dramatic, but we're talking about increasing forest cover by millions of hectares in an area that was becoming desert. The rate of desertification slowed significantly and then reversed in multiple provinces. The impact on dust storms became one of the most tangible measures of success. Beijing and other northern cities that had suffered through dozens of severe dust storms each year in the 1990s saw the frequency and intensity decline noticeably by the 2000s and 2010s. Spring no longer meant inevitable yellow skies. The dust reaching major cities decreased not just because of the trees, but because soil was being held in place by vegetation hundreds of kilometers away. The green belt was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Agricultural benefits started appearing as well. Areas where vegetation had been established for a decade or more showed improved soil quality. The plants added organic matter, their roots prevented erosion, and their presence affected local microclimates, sometimes increasing humidity and even local precipitation slightly. Farmers in buffer zones could grow crops again on land that had been too degraded to use productively. The numbers that shocked the world. By 2018, which marked 40 years since the project began, the statistics were remarkable. China had planted more than 66 billion trees across the 3 North region. That's not a typo. 66 billion individual trees covering approximately 33 million hectares. To put that in perspective, that's an area roughly the size of Finland covered in planted forests and vegetation. The economic value of this transformation ran into the hundreds of billions of dollars when you account for improved agricultural productivity, reduced damage from dust storms, carbon sequestration, and ecosystem services. Regions that had been on the verge of becoming uninhabitable saw population stabilization and even growth as economic opportunities returned with environmental restoration. Research published in scientific journals confirmed what satellite data showed. Studies documented increases in vegetation coverage, improvements in soil quality, and enhanced water retention in treated areas. The Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which measures plant health and coverage from satellite data, showed clear greening trends across northern China that correlated directly with project areas. One of the unexpected benefits was carbon sequestration. Those billions of trees were pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it as biomass. Estimates suggest the 3 North shelter belt had sequestered hundreds of millions of tons of carbon by the 2010s, making it one of the world's significant carbon sinks. This wasn't the original goal. Nobody was thinking about climate change in 1978, but it became a valuable side effect. The frequency of sandstorms affecting Beijing dropped from an average of about 26 days per year in the 1950s to fewer than 5 days per year by 2015. That's an 80% reduction, directly improving the lives of tens of millions of people. The health benefits alone, measured in reduced respiratory illness and related healthcare costs, justified a significant portion of the project's expense. From wasteland to farmland, real lives changed. The transformation wasn't just about environmental statistics. Real communities saw their lives change. In Yulin, a city in Shaanxi province that had been on the front lines of desertification, residents remember a time when sand dunes would literally invade the streets. Historical photos show buildings partially buried. By the 2010s, the area around Yulin had been transformed. Forests now surrounded what had been desert, and the city became a symbol of what determined reforestation could achieve. Farmers who had been forced to abandon land found they could return to agriculture. In some areas, the newly stabilized land supported not just basic crops but orchards. Apple orchards, jujube trees, and other fruit production became economically viable in regions that had been sand dunes decades earlier. This created jobs and income where there had been only environmental refugees. The project also transformed how communities related to their environment. Multiple generations participated in tree planting, creating a cultural shift. Young people who grew up planting trees and seeing results developed different attitudes toward environmental stewardship. This wasn't abstract environmentalism. It was practical work that directly improved their lives and futures. There were still challenges and failures. Some areas showed limited success despite decades of effort because the conditions were simply too harsh. Some tree species didn't perform as hoped. Certain regions saw trees grow for years only to die off when drought years hit particularly hard. The project wasn't perfect, and honest assessments acknowledged significant areas where results remained disappointing. But the overall trajectory was undeniably positive, which few had predicted. What other countries learned from this China's success with the 3 North Shelter Belt caught global attention, especially from other countries facing desertification. The United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification held up the project as a major case study. African nations dealing with the expanding Sahara Desert took particular interest. The African Union's Great Green Wall Initiative, launched in 2007 to combat desertification across the Sahel region, drew direct inspiration from China's experience. Countries like Mongolia, Pakistan, and various Central Asian nations sent delegations to study Chinese techniques. They learned about the sand barrier methods, the importance of selecting appropriate native species, and the organizational structures needed to sustain multi-decade projects. The checkerboard sand barriers and partial burial techniques spread to other countries facing similar challenges. International scientific cooperation increased around desertification combat. Chinese researchers published extensively about their methods and results, contributing to global knowledge about dryland restoration. While each region has unique conditions requiring adapted approaches, the fundamental lesson spread worldwide. Large-scale desertification can be reversed with sustained effort, appropriate techniques, and long-term commitment. The project also influenced global environmental policy discussions. It demonstrated that massive environmental restoration was possible and that governments willing to commit resources over decades could achieve results that seemed impossible in the short term. This perspective influenced international climate negotiations and discussions about ecosystem restoration as a tool for both environmental protection and economic development. The desert that became a forest. What seemed like an impossible dream in 1978 has become one of modern history's most successful environmental restoration projects. The deserts that were swallowing northern China have been stopped and pushed back in many areas. Cities that choked on dust storms breathe cleaner air. Farmland that had turned to wasteland grows crops again. The Great Green Wall stands as proof that humans can reverse environmental destruction on a massive scale when they commit to it. The project continues today, scheduled to run until 2050, and the forests keep growing. What the world laughed at decades ago is now studied and copied. Sometimes the crazy ideas turn out to be exactly what was needed.